What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today, we're going to be working on a 2008 BMW X3 E83. Today on the X3 behind me, we're going to be covering how to do a front-end refresh. One of the kits we have in front of us is the Lemforder control arm kit, which includes new tension struts and control arms and tie rods, as well as some end links, ball joints, and some hardware. To this, we have also added the Lemforder boot kit, as well as some additional hardware for the control arms, which are one-time use, all of which are linked in the video description below, all available on fcpeuro.com, as well as a couple different other options depending on what you're looking for. Something to note on the E83 chassis is the size of the ball joint changed over time. On the earlier models, they are a different size. So if you're looking to maybe just do the control arms and you have an early E83, just keep in mind that you're gonna have to update the ball joint with it because the size of the tapered hole on the control arm has changed. So if you have an early model, keep that in mind. Along with that, we're also going to be doing the tie rods as we mentioned before. This vehicle is approaching 190,000 miles on the original equipment, so it is certainly due for a refresh. A couple of things to consider if you're thinking about doing this or why you may want to do this job is if you have any weird play in the suspension. On this vehicle, the struts and the brakes are fairly new, but under heavy braking, you get a heavy shimmy at the steering wheel. That can be anything from a worn tie rod, a worn ball joint, a worn control arm bushing. In some cases, it can be a warped disc or it can be heavily worn out struts and or shocks. Seeing as how we have those already canceled out and the rest of the hardware on the car is original at almost 190,000 miles, more than likely all of these components are going to be due, and we'll show you how they've aged over time compared to the new Lemforder units that we're going to be installing. But before we get started on this job, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need. All right, my good people, for this DIY, we have what looks like quite a few tools out here, but truly, it's a lot of duplicates of what we got going on. Let's start off with the specialty tools. For this, you're gonna need a T40, a T50, as far as specialty sockets go. We have CTA, this is CTA 4013. This is a ball joint popper tool, which is always handy whenever you're doing tie rods or some control arms. We have our Lisle control arm tool. This is 43750. For those of you that want to search it up, these will also be linked in the description below. We have a couple pliers. We have our Oederker style clamp pliers since we're going to be doing new boots and new tie rods. As far as wrenches, we have both a 16, an 18, a 21, a 22, and a 13. A 24 for the locking pinch nut on the tie rods. Otherwise, a set of pliers will replace that, no problem. Sockets are kind of similar. We have both a 16, an 18, a 21, a 22. We have an 8 mil and a 10 mil, 17 one for our lug bolts. And along with those, we have a couple impact socket variants as well. We have a 3/8 drive and 1/2 inch drive ratchet, as well as some extensions to go with those, specifically a 3-inch and a 6-inch. We have a large torque wrench. It's a digital one, so it'll cover pretty much everything we need for today. A large hammer is always handy. Electrical tools make the job a little bit quicker. And we're using some ceramic paste for some of the hardware just to keep it from rusting on as we go on. Now, keep in mind with this, you're also going to need a floor jack and or a screw jack, depending on if you're working in the driveway, the garage, or on a lift. That's going to help when we go to torque everything down and sometimes for removing hardware as well, especially when you're dealing with tapered ends. A couple other things of note that you may want to come across while you're doing this job is maybe a wire brush or some penetrating fluid, depending on how crusty your hardware is. But for the most part, this will get you all the way through. And oh, of course, my favorite, a flathead screwdriver. Now with that, let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, we are over at the passenger side of the X3. We're going to be focusing on the passenger side today. However, the steps are going to be the same for the driver. The only thing that may change on your vehicle is if you have adaptive headlights, you're going to have the little sensor going to one of the control arms, which we'll cover over on the side. Just briefly before the wheel comes off, if you want to check for play, an easy thing you can do is grab your left and right side of your tire with the vehicle raised up, of course, and give it a wiggle left and right. We have just a little bit of play on this one, which is more than likely the tie rods, a little bit up and down if you want to check your wheel bearings, which can also be a cause for a shimmy. But if you have a shimmy due to wheel bearings, then at that point, that's pretty catastrophic. You're going to hear them first before you feel them. With that, we have 5 17mm lug bolts to remove. If you don't have an impact gun go ahead and leave the car on the ground, break these free with your breaker bar first, then you can lift it up and remove them the rest of the way. All right, now that we have the wheel off, we have a little bit of a better view of what we're going to be working with. Before we start removing any of the actual components we're replacing here, we have one more thing we want to remove, which is going to be the front splash shield. That's going to give us access to the hardware for this front tension strap. So let's go ahead and zap that off quickly, and then we'll continue on to the meat and potatoes. Underneath the vehicle, we have 11 8mm bolts that hold this front splash shield down, as well as 2 expanding plastic rivets. We'll go ahead and get the rivet out first. We're missing one on this vehicle, but we have one on either side. I'm just using a small set of pliers here to pull it out. These are actually the Oetiker clamp pliers that we're going to be using later. And then we'll zap out the 8mm going around. Start over at the front. All right, now we have that center splash shield out. Looking at it a little bit more from this side, this forward control arm bolt is very long, so we are going to go ahead and work on removing this ducting over here to get a little bit more room. We have 2 more 8mm bolts, and then we have a couple expanding rivets along the front here that we're going to separate. So let's go ahead and do those now. This is also a good time to spray everything down with PB Blaster if you haven't done so already. So while that soaks, we'll work on this. All right. With the 2 8mm removed, we can peel this back a little bit, and we can see one of the 10mm plastic nuts that holds this little divider in place, just kind of weaseled in between the subframe and the plastic shield here. And then there's one more 10mm on the opposite side. We're gonna get it out. You can probably fold it over at that point, but just to give you all good people a better view at home. We have one more 10mm on this side. And we can pull that out. Pull this off, and now we have all the room in the world to access that most forward control arm bolt. While we're here and we're in this area, we're not going to remove it all the way, but we're just going to go ahead and break that bolt free. So we'll go ahead and grab our wrenches and sockets and get ready to get that one loose. That's just going to help us move everything around, but we're not going to remove it just yet. So we have a 21mm head with a 21mm nut on the opposite side. There's a pocket on the inside of the subframe where you can get an open-ended wrench on there. We're gonna try to fit our Milwaukee in here and zap this 21 out, just to speed things up. With this most forward arm freed up from the subframe, we're gonna go ahead and continue on the theme and do the rearward arm as well. This is a thing where if your vehicle has adaptive headlights, you're gonna wanna pay a little bit of attention. You're gonna have a level sensor that is hooked up to that arm. Some vehicles do not have that, so if you don't have that, you can just skip ahead. But we'll go ahead and tackle that one quickly, and then we'll get to the subframe side of things on the rearward arm. Before we get started, this is something that may vary on your vehicle depending on how it is equipped. You may have a level sensor here that attaches to the control arm. If you do, you're gonna need a 10mm, just a small set of pliers for the back to get that off. I'm just gonna kind of hold the back side here. A nice little thin wrench will work as well. 10mm socket. I'm just gonna go ahead and free that up. If any of this hardware is looking extra crusty, be sure to spray a little bit of penetrating fluid before you start taking everything apart. Let it sit for a little bit. It'll make this job a lot easier. This one is surprisingly not that bad for being a New England car its whole life, but definitely have the PB Blaster on hand. We're just gonna thread the 10mm nut back on the arm, and we'll just kind of swing it out of the way. Just be mindful of it as we're working. We don't want to hurt it. On the rearward arm, we have a 16mm head on our bolt, and we have an 18mm nut on the back side. So we're just going to use 2 wrenches, an 18 and a 16, to break this free first. Now that we have the subframe side of things loosened up for the control arms, let's head over to the knuckle side of things. We're gonna go ahead and work on the rearward arm first, getting that locking nut right underneath our axle boot. So let's get to that one now. For this nut, we're gonna need a 22mm wrench. I have this cutoff one that we've used on a couple different videos. I'm just gonna place it on there like so, take my hammer and break this locking nut free. I'm going to switch over to a full-size wrench now that we've broken the nut free and just work it off the rest of the way. If at any point you're doing this and the ball joint end starts to spin on you, you can put some weight on here with a screw jack or floor jack, push this tapered end into the knuckle, and that should keep it from spinning. Wire wheel your threads if they're a little gunky or rusty, and it'll make that nut removal a lot easier. With this arm nice and loose, we have our first view. Oh yeah, let me get this arm out of the way. Quick reminder, if you do have the level sensor, there is a little bracket that keys into the subframe. It is also held in place by this rearward control arm bolt, but let's take a look at that. She is toast. So this is one of two down. We're gonna go ahead and set this to the side and continue on. We'll get our new one in and we're just gonna kind of get it in place loosely for now. Then we'll get our other one out and then we'll tighten them both down at the same time. Now, before we get this arm replaced, we're gonna let it hang out here for a little bit. We can go ahead and pull it out if we like. The bolt that holds it in also holds in the bracket for the headlight level sensor if your car is equipped with that. We're gonna keep this one out just because we're gonna need the access from above to get our air hammer tool in here to blow this ball joint out. So for now, we're gonna work on removing the forward arm. We're gonna blast this nut off with the Milwaukee. Same thing, if it's giving you a hard time and you can't counter hold it, put some weight on it, get that tapered nice and tight, put a floor jack under here or a screw jack if you do get to that point. Hopefully you don't. So we're gonna go ahead and try to zap that off and then go from there. We're gonna take a 22 mil socket on our impact and try to get this bottom nut off. No problem. And now with that off, we're gonna go ahead and give it a couple hits. You can see we already tried that prior to getting to this point. We were taking a different approach that wasn't working out well. So if you ever get in that situation, my good people, just stop for a minute, take a look at what you're doing and try a different way. So we'll give it a couple whacks with the hammer. If it doesn't free it up, we'll switch over to a different tool. Let's see what we can get here. Okay. With that freed up, luckily this arm swings the other way, so we weren't in danger, but you can see how quickly they can pop off. And that's whether you're hitting it with a hammer, you're using a pickle fork, or a ball joint popper tool. Now we can just go ahead and pull that bolt out that we freed up earlier. And get our forward thrust arm out of the way. At this point, we still have the tie rod connected. We're gonna wrap it up with that, but we're gonna leave that attached for now. Our next goal is gonna be to remove this ball joint. So let's go ahead and work on that next. One thing to note when you're doing these kind of jobs is if you're removing factory parts or original parts and replacing them with a newer updated version, sometimes the hardware also changes over time from the manufacturers. In this case, the ball joint hardware are two E12s or a smushed E12 and a regular E12. The new hardware for the new Lemforder ball joints are T50s. So just keep that in mind. It's not weird to see different heads on the hardware that you're going to be installing or removing. We're going to take our E12, zap those out. We'll work on the mushroom one up. Maybe we'll shove a little bit of a bigger socket on there to get that out. Once we get those two out, then comes the fun part of removing the ball joint itself, which is going to be super critical to have that air hammer like we talked about at the beginning. All right, at this point, our ball joint is unbolted. You can try to work at them with a small chisel and pick between the knuckle and the ball joint here to start breaking it up, but these are usually pretty tight in there. The easiest way we found to take them out is with an air hammer. So we're gonna get the air hammer set up. We'll get a little bit more eye level with the situation and we'll blast this baby out of here. All right, now we're just taking our air hammer. We're gonna push up against the boot a little bit, but not too much where we're gonna break it. Get that nice and taut. And there we go. That is our old ball joint. You can see these have two ears, look identical on either side, but they do have a little hump, if you will. This is going to be facing towards the inside, towards the subframe. So it's going to be visible versus the backside that isn't. So just helps you orientate them. They really only go in one way. We're going to raise the car back up, clean that area up really nicely. Maybe get a little bit of ceramic paste in there. And then we'll get our new one in. We'll start throwing some arms back in and move on to the tie rod. We have our housing cleaned up in the knuckle. Standard stuff you've seen us do before, just a little wire wheel action to clean out that hole a little bit. I'm going to use a little bit of ceramic paste on this one just in case we have to do this again someday down the road. Not super necessary, as you're still probably going to have to air hammer the, at the time then, old one out, but it's going to keep everything from seizing up on each other and making it a little bit easier to work with. We have it going in most of the way. We're going to take our new T50 hardware, which already has some thread locker on it. These are super necessary. You definitely want to replace these every time you remove them. Just going to get our hardware started by hand. Now these are sitting nicely in here. It's almost in all the way. So we're just going to use the hardware to snug it up the rest of the way. Let's say it was sticking out maybe twice the amount that it is now, maybe a 1/4 inch or more. You wouldn't want to drive it in with the hardware, as you can risk bending in the tabs. Take a small punch and maybe a brass punch and hammer and just gently work the ears in that way as well. So we're going to take our T50, just the electric ratchet, snug these up gently. And now we're going to switch over to the torque wrench, and we're going to torque these bad boys down to 60 Newton meters. Now with that, we can work in the reverse. We can go ahead and get our forward arm installed once more. So let's grab that and our fresh hardware and work on that now. All right, so we're going to take our arm, feed it into place, get our bolt through. I like to put a little bit of ceramic paste on the shank part of the bolt that goes into the control arm metal bushing, or the metal sleeve of the bushing, so that it doesn't seize to the control arm by chance. Obviously the old hardware came out fine, but sometimes that can happen. Just don't get any on the threaded end. Now we can feed our nut on the other side. We're just going to get these started by hand first. Okay, now we have our ball joint end. Make sure the tapered side is facing the correct way. Swing that baby up. Just push on that for now and get the nut started by hand. All right, we're going to let that hang out there. We're not going to tighten anything just yet. Now with that in place, we can get the rearward arm in. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, we're going to go ahead and feed our hardware in. We have our right arm again stamped with an R. This one also has the little tab on it for the headlight level sensor. We're going to go ahead and feed this baby through, putting a little bit of ceramic paste on the part that's going to live inside of the control arm sleeve. Okay, don't forget, if your car is equipped with the sensor, to get that keyed back into the subframe. Here's a better view of that little ear going into the subframe. That's going to make sure that that sensor is at the correct position so it can do its job properly. And we're just going to get the nut started by hand again. And then we can swing the ball joint end up and over and into the knuckle. Okay. All right, so at this point we have our control arms in, our ball joints in. We're going to be ready to tighten everything down. So we're going to grab our screw jack since we're on the lift. For those of you at home, grab your floor jack. We're going to work on tightening down the ball joint side of things first, setting the car to ride height like we talked about at the beginning of the video, and then we'll do the subframe side of the hardware, again, at ride height. So let me grab our screw jack. We're going to work on the rearward arm first and just work in reverse. Similar to how you may have done for the removal, we're going to use the screw jack and or your floor jack, depending on your work situation, to tighten up this tapered end on the control arm to keep it from allowing the ball joint end to spin. The torque spec for the locking nut on the opposite side is going to be 80 Newton meters. If you can get a socket in there, if you have some really low profile sockets, that will work. Also a crow's foot, if you have a crow's foot in the proper size. Because 80 is not so high, we're not so worried about under torquing it. If anything, we may over torque. So we're just going to snug them up nicely, kind of get a feel for how the old one was on there before. And we're going to switch back to our 22 millimeter wrench. and just get this nice and snugged up. Now with that, we're just gonna go ahead and give it the final snug down. Again, 22 millimeter crow's foot would be super handy here. 80 Newton meters total, so not a whole lot. With that one situated, we're gonna do the same thing to the forward arm. We have our screw jack set up on the forward arm. Now, because this one's at a little bit of an angle with the ball joint and the way it comes out, you're not gonna get the same pressure going up on the tapered end as you would on the rearward arm. So we're just kind of holding it there to snug it up a little bit. We're gonna just snug it up with the impact, but we're not gonna crank it down with the impact because we still wanna torque it down properly. So we're just gonna grab our impact socket, 22 mil, get the nut a little bit closer to the arm, and then we'll torque it down properly. Okay, we're not touching the arm yet, but we're close enough where it's gonna save us a little bit of time. Torque wrench set to 80 Newton meters, just like the other one. And we're gonna go ahead and snug it down. Okay, with that nice and snugged up, we're gonna hit it with the paint pen, just so that we remember that we've torqued it and mark it down. So now we have these situated, we're gonna move our screw jack back towards the rear arm, just gives us a little bit of a better place to lift up from. Same thing with your floor jack. We're gonna set the vehicle to ride height. Again, we covered a couple of different ways to do that at the beginning of the video. So once you choose your method, set everything to ride height, and then we're gonna snug up the hardware on the subframe. We have a 16 on our electric ratchet, and we have an 18 mil wrench. We're just gonna counter hold the 18 mil nut on the back side of the rear arm, snug this up, and then we're gonna torque them down properly. Okay, just snugged up. We're gonna torque that down to 100 Newton meters plus an additional 90 degrees. Okay. Now we're at 100. We're gonna mark our bolt. If you have a torque wrench that does angle mode, now would be the time to use that. But you can also just use a paint pen, mark the bolt on an easy to see spot, and then we're gonna rotate it an additional 90 degrees, and that'll situate this one. Beautiful. And with that, this inner arm is all set. This is also why we recommend that you replace all the hardware. They are one-time use with these type of stretch bolts. With that one situated, we're gonna move over to the front. So let's get set up for that now. With the forward arm ready to rock, we're gonna take our 21 on our electric ratchet, and we have our 21 on our open-ended wrench. We're just gonna snug it up first with the electric ratchet, and then we'll torque it down properly. Just getting nice and snug. Now we'll switch over to the 21 on the torque wrench. Similar to the rear one, this is a torque to yield bolt as well. That's gonna get torqued down to 165 Newton meters plus an additional 90 degrees. Now the wrench isn't moving on the other side, so I know that the wrench is kind of stuck in place. That means the nut is not spinning, but obviously you wanna make sure that you're still counter holding during the additional 90 degrees. All right, with that situated, that's gonna button up the control arm portion of this. We still have the tie rod, so we're gonna go ahead and get our underbelly situated back here, just this corner piece here, so we don't forget about it later. We'll leave the splash shield off for now, just to give us as much room as possible with the tie rod. But for now, let's get these two 10 mils back in. We'll button up this little corner and go from there. So we're gonna take our little divider once more, get this baby fed up in there. There's a stud coming off of the rail. It kind of helps you line it up. And then we're just gonna get our 10 mil situated on the inside first. And then we're gonna switch over to the long 6-inch extension with the 10 mil socket and the 10 mil plastic nut. And we'll snug up this one super gently because it is a plastic nut. And while I have your attention, we'll go ahead and take care of the two 8mm bolts just for that little part of the shield. And then we can move on. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to reconnect your headlight level sensor. Make sure you feed that rod through the control arm, and then just gently snug up the 10mm nut. It doesn't need to be that tight. Just a quick little cinch and you're good to go. Okay, Now let's go and head over to the tie rod section of this DIY. So we're gonna get a little bit more eye level with everything. But before we do that, if you haven't already, you wanna make sure that you break free the pinch nut that keeps the tie rod assembly locked from adjustment. So we're gonna go ahead and break that free first. That's a 24 mil nut. It's a kind of an odd size. If you don't have a wrench that size, use an adjustable or even vice grips if you have to, but an adjustable so you don't mar it up would be best. So we're gonna make sure that that will break free first, and then we can go ahead and work on the actual removal. We've left our locking nut to soak up a little bit, or pinch bolt, pinch nut. I mean, it's a literal nut, but we have a couple of different terms. It is a 24 mil, so if you have a wrench that size, that's gonna be the way to go. Our goal here is to go ahead and break it free. Now, if you wanna get kind of close to what your alignment is, you can get the car to the shop, which of course you know by now you're gonna have to get the car there. Go ahead and take this time to measure your old tie rod. So you can take something like a pair of calipers. Maybe you're gonna measure from the little ridge on the tie rod where the boot edge sits to the locking nut, whatever the case may be. Write that number down. This will get you close enough so that when you put your new setup together, you can go ahead and get a rough alignment to get you to the shop. So we're gonna go ahead and break this nut free, and then we're gonna go ahead and get a little bit more eye level and get the locking nut on the end of the ball joint off. We're just gonna use some pliers to get these babies off. Since we are gonna be replacing this, we're not too worried about damaging the nut on this. So that is nice and broken free. That's exactly what we wanna see. And then we also wanna make sure that this side is gonna be able to separate itself from the tie rod end. For this, we have a 22 millimeter wrench, fits right over the body. All right, we'll just give that a couple turns. Now we're gonna get more eye level and get that locking nut off. All right, at the end of the ball joint, we have a 22 millimeter locking nut, similar to the ball joints that we just did on the arm. Same thing, if you have a nut that's spinning on you and you don't wanna use the counter hold, you can just put a little bit of pressure on the bottom of the tie rod, get that tapered in nice and cinched up, and you should be able to break it free. We're gonna give it a shot with the impact 22 millimeter socket and see if we can get it off. Now, same deal, you can use your hammer, hit that end and get that off, or for those of you that haven't seen us use the CTA tool in some of our other DIYs, we'll go ahead and demonstrate it now. Get that into place. Give it a couple taps with the hammer. And with that, our ball joint is out. Now we're gonna work on freeing it up from the inner tie rod. So we're gonna work on removing the outer tie rod first. We're gonna take our 13 millimeter wrench, and that's gonna be our counter hold on the inner tie rod. We'll just let it bottom up against the knuckle. And I'm gonna try a 22 millimeter wrench to break the tie rod end free. All right, my people, unfortunately, this is so frozen shut. I mean, these are, as far as I can tell, original. Whether or not they've been replaced, they've been on here for a long time, but they still have the BMW stamp on them, which to me indicates that they just have never been done. 190,000 miles, they're rusted shut in there. So this is another reason why you may be replacing them. Perhaps you went to go ahead in alignment and the text told you that they are frozen shut. Typically what they mean is that the inner and outer are frozen together, they have rusted together, and the adjustment can be made. The adjustment would be done here where we were getting the 13 millimeter wrench on before. Should be nice and easy to do. These have been on there for a long time. They're not gonna come off. So we have to resort to some brutality. We're just gonna cut them off and then we'll be able to get them apart. So just keep that in mind, especially if you're in the Northeast like we are or in the Rust Belt. These can seize up and it makes this a lot harder. We're gonna do something to prevent that from happening on the new ones, which we'll cover during the install. But for now, we're just gonna go ahead, cut this behind the locking nut, and then we'll be able to separate the two, get our boot off, and work on removing the inner portion of the tie rod. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now we're gonna work on removing the outer clamp. This will allow us to pull the boot all the way over. We have one more clamp. This is an Oederker clamp. We're gonna take our flathead and just kind of pry it open, break it open. These are one-time use. Don't be too gentle on it. Almost got it off, there we go. And now with that off, we can work this boot out. And that is gonna expose our axial joint, which currently is sitting right underneath our sway bar. So we're gonna grab our tie rod removal tool, see which size fits the best, and get that out. Now this side, with the weight of the outer tie rod, was fairly loose. It's not horrible, which is kind of impressive for how many miles are on it. So there's a good chance they may have been replaced at some point, but nonetheless, they were frozen. So even if we did an alignment without changing these, it wouldn't have been able to be done. So let's go ahead and work that off now. So for this, we're gonna be using the 1.5 inch adapter from the Lisle tool. We're gonna get this one situated in place, and then we'll lock it in. Now we're gonna take our 1/2 inch ratchet, just using the long breaker bar style one. Some vehicles use a locking tab on the back side. The E83 does not have one, but that is something that is commonly found oftentimes. Threads on here are nice and clean, which means our threads are nice and clean there. If you had any bit of oil or grease or residue, go ahead and clean that off before you install the new inner tie rod. But if everything checks out, you can go ahead and get your new one started by hand. And then we're gonna use the same removal tool to install the new one, and then we're gonna torque it down. Our end of the rack looks nice and clean, no leaks, which is a good sign. Oftentimes the seals can get tired, especially at high mileage. We have our new tie rod end ready to go. The threads on that rack are nice and clean. This are nice and clean as well. We're gonna go ahead and feed that in by hand first. Once we get it snugged up by hand, then we can torque it down properly. We're gonna be using the same removal tool as our install tool. Okay, that's nice and snug. We're gonna feed the tool on. Now this one will fit over the tie rod. Some axial joints have a lip on them, and you have to put the tool together on the actual inner tie rod. This one slides right on, no problem. Torque spec for this is gonna be 110 Newton meters. So we're gonna go ahead and set the torque wrench to that, and then we'll snug it up. You don't wanna over tighten it. You don't wanna hurt the gear on the rack. And something that I like to do when I tighten these down is actually go to the opposite side. I'm gonna turn the driver's side wheel, in this case, left, pulling that rack in a bit more so that the shaft isn't hanging out so much as we're torquing it down, and it'll give us a little bit more room for our tool here. So you can see that inner tie rod go in as I do this. So now we can feed this baby in. There we go. Now we have more room for that torque wrench. Set it to 110 Newton meters. There we go. Just had to reposition ourselves. Now our tool is nice and locked in. We can take our new boot, slide that over. You want to slide it in with the clamp already just hanging out around the boot. Wipe off the rack if there's any debris or old oil leakage or buildup on it before you slide that on. And just for a quick visual, when we were measuring earlier on the old tie rod, you'll see these little rings here, these little lips. The outer lip is where the boot is going to end. That's where we were measuring from to the locking nut, just to give you a better idea of what I meant by that little stepped lip there. We have our new boot. Clamp is nice and loose, but it's hanging out on the outside of it. I like to use a little bit of dielectric grease sometimes to help feed it over the rack. They can be a little bit stubborn at times. I'm just gonna twist it back and forth. Nice and even on the rack. It's not cocked or at an angle. And there, it looks good. Our clamp is in the right spot. Now we can go ahead and get our specialty pliers and cinch that baby down. We have our clamp positioned how we want it. We have our pliers going in. The goal is to grab the head of that clamp and then bite it and cinch it down. That is nice and tight. I'm gonna turn the wheel back straight since we turned it left earlier to get the boot and the rack axial joint a little bit closer to everything. So now we're gonna even it back out, straighten out our wheel over here. We're gonna make sure that the end of the boot is sitting on the proper ridge, like we talked about earlier. So you just push it back a little bit, find that ridge, and there it is. Now we can put the outer clamp on, also included with the boot kit. Nice fresh unit. And these are soft enough that you can just do it by hand and pinch it on like so. Now, what we are going to do Next is going to feed on our new locking nut, or a new pinch nut. We'll just send that in. We're not going to be worried about where it's going to sit just yet. Now we're going to take our magic juice, our ceramic paste from Liqui Moly, and we're going to cover the inside of these threads. These are the ones that live on the inside of the outer tie rod. And this will keep them from freezing. So in another 100, 200,000 miles, that will keep them on that long. Whenever they need to be adjusted, they will be nice and free. It's a bit overkill on how much I put on there, but if it means not struggling with it again like I just did a moment ago, then that's going to be the way. We have our collar that helps cinch down the outer tie rod. Make sure that the tapered end faces outward towards the tapered end on the outer tie rod. Okay, now we're getting closer. We can set that locking nut roughly to what our measurement was before on the old one using the calipers, just so that we can have a rough idea of where to set it. And then from there, obviously, once you get the wheel back on, if the wheels are totally pointed inwards at each other, grab your 13mm wrench, loosen up the lock nut, and just make a quick adjustment before you head over to the shop. But if they're pointed fairly straight, then you should be okay. We're going to double check our work on that here, and then we'll go ahead and snug up the ball joint end and the locking nut. Now we're happy where the alignment is, eyeball alignment that is. We're going to take our 24mm wrench and just snug up this locking nut. They're going to undo this when you go get an alignment, so don't worry about setting it to spec or anything like that. What I do recommend though is, and not that you wouldn't be able to notice, but it never hurts to just do a little paint mark on it, just so that you can see that they actually moved everything, adjusted everything, and did an actual alignment on your vehicle. With that, I'm just turning the assembly right now so I can have a better view and show you exactly what we're going to do. But we have a 22 on the small electric ratchet. The torque spec for that 22mm nut is going to be 80 Newton meters, similar to the other ball joints. But our goal here is to get it to just snug up. I'm going to push up with my arm. If not, we can switch over to the floor jack or screw jack, put a little bit of pressure on there so we don't have to counter hold. If we do have to counter hold, not the end of the world. But for now, let's give the quick electric tool a shot. And you guessed it, we're going to counter hold. So just to show you how that would work, if you don't have the ability to cinch it up, we're going to grab our 22mm wrench, and we're going to grab our Torx with that 1/4" ratchet and snug that baby up. We have our T40. The T40 is the same counter hold needed for all of the ball joints we've installed today, just FYI. And we have our 22mm wrench. We're just going to go ahead and snug these babies in here, make sure that T40 is seated nicely. And we're just going to counter hold and just keep snugging up. At a certain point, the tapered end is going to sit in there nicely. It won't allow the ball joint to spin anymore. And then we can give it the final 80 Newton meter torque. There we go. You bent up your shield, make sure you bend it back. And with that, we're going to hit it with a little bit of the paint pen so that we know it's been torqued down and marked. But for now, we're just going to work on getting our wheel back on. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to throw the splash shield back on. Again, it's 8mm bolts, 11 of them, and 2 expanding rivets. For now, we're going to move forward, get our wheel on, drop it on the ground, and then we'll show you how to torque them down. Now we're going to throw our wheel on. We're just going to get these snugged up with the impact in a crisscross pattern, just to make sure the wheel is sitting flush up against the hub. Then we'll lower the vehicle down and give them the final torque. With our vehicle down on the ground, we're going to torque in a crisscross pattern using the 17 to 120 Newton meters. And with that, my good people, that is going to conclude this DIY for today. Overall, a pretty straightforward job on the E83. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, Leave those in the comment section below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.